Hello, everybody, and welcome to a very special edition of Gone But Never Forgotten. This week, I am very happy to announce that for the first time in a long, long time, I have someone sitting in the co-host chair with me. I am very lucky to welcome to the show a longtime friend of mine and a true crime connoisseur, Bailey. Welcome to the GBNF Madhouse, Bailey.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here, Lance, and I just really want to say thank you again for allowing me here and sharing your audience and listeners with me. I really hope I can do this episode justice because your YouTube has a legacy of amazing episodes already.
I'm trying my best, and you and I, we've hemmed and hawed about trying this out a time or four, and I'm excited to actually try to record this and see how many hiccups we can come across along the way. The work is done. We've both done the research, and now let's see if we can get this thing out there and live to the masses, shall we?
We do want to add a disclaimer to this episode because this episode contains graphic descriptions of crime scenes, criminal activities, sexual violence, and torture, more than what you are probably used to from this channel and many. Listener discretion is highly advised. The FBI reportedly uses this case and elements of it to desensitize their recruits. Just saying.
It's true. These two men managed to do even more psychological and physical damage in 5 short months than most serial killers have caused in an entire career. Roy Lewis Norris was born on February 5th of 1948 in Greeley, Colorado, and he was conceived out of wedlock. His parents decided to get married when the pregnancy happened so that they would avoid the stigma of giving birth without being married. Norris's father worked in a scrapyard, and his mother stayed at home, and she was heavily addicted to drugs and alcohol, frequently choosing both over being anything that resembled a good parent. Norris did spend bits and spurts of time living at home with his parents, but he also spent much of his childhood bouncing around within the Colorado foster care system. Norris would claim that he was abused both physically and sexually, as well as starved and neglected by his foster family, as well as his biological family. Norris says that he remembers being denied food and clothing, and he said that when he lived with one Hispanic family in particular, they had abused him, and he believed that that abuse had caused a large part of the racism that he harbored growing up. While Norris was living with his parents when he was 16 years old, he went to visit a female family member. She was in her 20s, and while he was there, Norris started to speak and act in a sexual manner towards her, and she became enraged and demanded that Norris leave her house. She also contacted Norris's father and told him about the incident, and of course, he too became furious. Norris said that he remembers that he did catch one hell of a beating that day, and in response, Norris stole his father's car and he drove into the Rocky Mountains and attempted to take his own life by injecting pure air into an artery in his arm. Police would wind up finding Norris and returning him to his parents' home because he was labeled as a runaway. So, off the top, I will say I'm certainly not one to advocate for suicide. I know people who tragically took their lives, and thankfully I myself failed as a teen to take my own. However, with that said, I can't help but think how much better off the world would have been if Norris had ultimately been successful that day in the Rocky Mountains. He would have never met Bittaker, and so many of the crimes that we're going to talk about today would have been prevented. Bailey, do you think the world would have been better off without Norris in it?
I completely agree with you. I too have lost way too many people, unfortunately, to suicide, and I definitely don't think that anyone in their life should feel that low at any point. But I do feel that if he did succeed, it would have saved a lot of people, a lot of trauma, a lot of unnecessary scarring memories, and quite a few lives.
Yeah, it's one of those things you never want to advocate for, obviously. But this is one of those cases where if you're not familiar with the case we're covering today, you're going to see why this might be one of those cases where suicide would have saved a lot of people, a lot of pain, and a lot of lives. Not too long after Norris was returned home from that trip into the Rocky Mountains, his parents told him and his younger sister that when they reached the age where they could both move out, they were going to get a divorce. Essentially, they were told that they were unwanted and that their parents had stayed together because of their unwanted births. This would have certainly been a shot to the egos of both children. A year later, Norris made the decision to leave his parents' home on his own, and he dropped out of high school and joined the U.S. Navy at the age of 17. Norris was stationed in San Diego in 1965, and then he was deployed as a part of the Vietnam War to Vietnam, where he did not end up seeing active duty, and he came home after a 4-month tour of duty. In November of 1969, not long after he was discharged from the Navy, he was arrested for rape and assault with attempt to commit rape when he attempted to force his way into a lone woman's car. Less than 3 months after his arrest, Norris would be diagnosed by military psychologists with schizoid personality disorder, which is characterized by a lack of interest in social relationships, a tendency towards solitary or sheltered life, secretiveness, emotional coldness, detachment, and apathy. In May of 1970, when Norris was out on bail for those first offenses, he would attack a female student that he had been stalking on the campus of San Diego University. Norris struck her repeatedly in the back of her head with a rock until she fell to her knees, and then he repeatedly beat her head against the sidewalk while kneeling on her lower back. Norris was charged at the time with assault with a deadly weapon, and he was committed to 5 years imprisonment at the Atascadero State Hospital, and he was classified as a mentally disordered sex offender. After serving those 5 years, he was released in 1975 with 5 years of probation because he was declared as an individual who was of no further danger to others. I'm going to stop here for a second. This kind of stuff drives me crazy. We've seen it so many times on episodes of the podcast, and I understand that there are probably far more cases of people actually rehabilitating and being released back into the public, and then they don't offend. But how many times have we seen in true crime, Bailey, errors like this, where you look at someone like Norris who clearly has issues and gets released back into the public? It also doesn't take him long to prove, as we'll get to in a minute, that he was still a massive threat to other people. How does it make you feel as a true crime fan, I guess we'll call it, when you see cases like this, where you see someone who's about to commit far worse atrocities, essentially just let out of prison because they say he's rehabilitated?
Oh, I cannot count how many stories or cases I have come across because they are quote unquote rehabilitated. I feel like every place has a flaw in their justice system. And sometimes, yes, reform does work for people, but it's clear in this case where he's been a serial reoffender that it just didn't work in this case. And the fact that these medical professionals could take one look at his record and be like, oh, he's not going to do this again is baffling to me because, like I said, he was a serial reoffender. Do you think it's possible for the potential future victims to go back and possibly claim medical negligence on these doctors for not actually doing their job?
I don't know what it's like in the States. I know that stuff like that has happened in Canada. Like there is There are, I would imagine in the States it would be possible because they're even more lawsuit happy down there than we are up here. But you're about to cover Bittaker, and it's like these are two men that ultimately spent more time in jail than out of jail for, from their teenage years to the time that they finally got put away. And it's like, how do you see someone, especially with Norris, you have someone who seemingly jumped right into rape and assault, like he was a sexual offender. And we have people that are getting put away for dealing marijuana in the United States and in Canada before it was legalized for longer periods of time than sexual offenders. And it blows my mind. Like, we're keeping people that are, I guess I will call them minimal offenders, longer in prison than people that are doing harm to others. And it blows my mind. So, as I said, Norris did not waste any time in proving that he fooled people. 3 months after he was released from the hospital, 3 months, he approached a 27-year-old woman who was walking home from a restaurant in Redondo Beach, and he offered her a ride on his motorcycle. When the woman declined the offer, Norris grabbed her by her scarf, twisted it tightly around her neck, and then told her that he was going to rape her. Norris then dragged her into the nearby bushes, and out of fear for her life, the woman did not resist. Thankfully, Norris let the woman go afterwards, and she was able to report the sexual assault to the police. But police were not able to identify her attacker at first. Believe it or not, a month later, perhaps showing how bright he wasn't, the woman again saw Norris on his motorcycle, and this time she took down the license plate number and turned it in to the police. Norris was then arrested for rape, and 1 year later he was tried and convicted and sent to California's men's colony in San Luis Obispo. While Norris was imprisoned there, he would meet another monster who was incarcerated there. His name was Lawrence Bittaker.
I don't even know where to begin with this one, so we're going to attempt to start at a very convoluted beginning for this individual. Lawrence Sigmund Bittaker was born on September 27th, 1940 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. There's a bit of a conflicting story about his childhood. It's been said that his aunt forced his mother to give up both of her children, Bittaker and his younger brother, to family members as she was seen as an unfit parent, ultimately resulting in both of them being adopted by their great aunt and uncle. This is a story that Bittaker has told over and over again, but it was also stated that he was left at an orphanage. I guess this is a beginning that we will never know the truth about. Bittaker's adoptive father worked within the aviation industry, and as such, that required the family to move around the country quite a bit and caused a lot of trauma to Bittaker, who never really felt that he was able to set his roots down anywhere, and said he never really had the opportunity to make very many friends. People who knew Bittaker and his family said that his upbringing was said to be above standard for the time, but he would argue that appearances weren't everything. He said that while he was living with his adoptive parents, he felt more like a boarder than he felt like part of the family. He said that yes, room and board were provided for him, but aside from that, not very much was provided. He said he kept to himself, never really felt celebrated or loved in any regard by his family. He would later go on to say that if someone maybe had just shown him a little bit of love in his life, that maybe he would not have turned out the way he ultimately did. Bittaker's criminal life started at a very young age. When he was just 12 years old, he was arrested for petty theft and theft. Bittaker also developed a love for fire at a very early age. Once, when he broke into a man's home and stole from him, he also set the curtains on fire. Bittaker also burned down at least 2 sheds. Bittaker said that he was just acting out to try and get some sort of attention from his family, and in return for his behavior to teach him a lesson about fire, he said that his mother pulled down his pants and burned him with a cigarette multiple times.
So I'll stop you there. It's no secret to the listeners of the podcast, I do tend to humanize the serial killers a little more than most when I cover them on the podcast. And one has to wonder here if this particular incident with the cigarette from his mother was a trigger point. that created his desire for torture and for sexual sadism. I mean, we see him here forced into a position where great pain was caused to him against his will as a punishment. And of course, it was inflicted on him by his mother, who was the prominent female in his life. Do you think, obviously neither one of us is psychologically trained, but do you think, after looking at so many true crime cases, that this was a trigger point for Bittaker?
I definitely think that, especially relating it to other cases as well, we see a pattern where there's a lot of parental neglect or a lot of parental abuse, and children learn at a very young age what they believe to be acceptable. So at a young age, this could definitely trigger him into thinking that it's perfectly okay to gain control over somebody by hurting them or forcing them to do something that they don't want to do. And it also kind of leads to the whole argument of nature versus nurture, I find, because they do also say that criminals and serial killers have this natural gene called the serial killer gene. But we're finding more and more that a lot of the cases that we come across, it's a lack thereof nurture from the family that has kind of developed these people into who they turned out to be.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. I mean, you're looking at two men in Norris and Bittaker who have that in their past, and you have to believe that as they got to know each other, that would be a point where they kind of realized they had things in common. But we see it so many times. Like, we talked about it off air. It's like, how many serial killers do we read about that are coming from a perfect, loving home? It doesn't happen all that often. This is the kind of thing where, this is what we see. First of all, their home life is dreadful. In the cases of both of these men, at least based on what they told people afterwards, they didn't have a good family life. And in this case, you literally have his mom inflicting pain on him. So whether it was out of something he enjoyed that way, or it became a reason for hatred towards his mother, and also that piece would come with that sexual sadism, I do think that, like, this particular part of his backstory, we'll say, is definitely a part of what turned him and at least helped determine the type of monster that he was going to be.
It only gets worse from here. So buckle up. Bittaker's offenses only got worse from there, and he dropped out of high school in 1957 at the age of 17. Bittaker had been tested for his IQ, and his IQ is considered very high, 138, which is in the moderately gifted range, and not that far from being considered a near genius. However, Bittaker found school to be exceptionally tedious. Even though he didn't have much of a social life, he spoke very highly of a girlfriend that he had around this time, named Mary Ann. Mary Ann was a beautiful blonde girl who had big blue eyes, and many have hypothesized that she was the reason that many of the women that Bittaker targeted had a similar look. Mary Ann also wore a cross most times, and in the photos that Bittaker would later force his captives to take, he would often force them to also wear a cross. This is believed to be some sort of homage to his long-lost love with Mary Ann. Bittaker said that he had told Mary Ann he loved her once, and she had responded and said that she liked him very much. Another thing that Bittaker remembered as long as he lived, he never really felt that anyone did or could possibly love him. Not long after dropping out of school, Bittaker would be arrested and charged with auto theft, evading arrest, and a hit and run, and he was sentenced to the California Youth Authority, where he was to be kept there until he turned 18. There are varying reports about what happened with his adoptive parents at this time. Bittaker says that when he turned 18 and was released from the CYA, he learned that his family maybe moved on to another state and just deserted him. It was also reported elsewhere, though, that his adoptive parents tried multiple times to help Bittaker to turn his life around, at least until he was 20 years old, and then ultimately had to give up on him. Regardless of what story you believe, though, after the age of 20, he did not see his adoptive parents ever again. Between the ages of 18 and 24, Bittaker would then see himself in a never-ending carousel of in and out of prison. Within days of being released from the CYA, he was arrested for transporting a stolen vehicle across state lines, and he was sentenced to 18 months in prison to be served at the Oklahoma State Reformatory. He was released early, as would become a pattern, as we've all seen. And he was then arrested within a few months, now back in California. This time, he was arrested for robbery and would be sentenced in March of 1961 to 15 years in prison. While in prison this time, he was characterized as being a highly manipulative man who had a considerable amount of concealed hostility built up inside of him. However, even with that knowledge and his track record, Bittaker would be released after serving only 2 years of his sentence. In October, yet again, Bittaker was arrested in 1964, this time for a parole violation. In 1966, Bittaker was given further evaluation in an attempt to try and find out why he was a career prisoner, and 2 independent psychiatrists classified him as a borderline sociopath. It was said that he was highly manipulative and that he was unable to acknowledge the consequences of his actions. Bittaker told the psychiatrist that his crimes gave him a feeling of self-importance. He was prescribed antipsychotic medication, and a year later, in June of 1967, he was again released from prison. As I'm sure comes as no shock, it didn't take long for Bittaker to again get himself in trouble. 1 month after his parole in 1967, he was arrested again. This time, he was arrested for theft and fleeing the scene of an accident. He was sentenced, this time, to 5 years in prison, but again was released early in April of 1970. In 1971, he was then arrested for burglary, and due to his repeat violations, he was sentenced to serve between 6 months and 15 years in prison, which was seen to be as an indefinite sentence. Bittaker would serve less than 3 years, though, and again he was released and back out on the streets. Surprise, surprise. In 1974, his crimes escalated greatly, as he was arrested for assault with attempt to commit murder when he stabbed an employee at a supermarket. The employee had witnessed Bittaker stealing a steak and followed him out into the parking lot, where he asked Bittaker if he had maybe forgotten to pay for the meat. In response, Bittaker stabbed the employee in the chest, narrowly missing his heart. Bittaker tried to flee the scene on foot, but he was apprehended by 2 other employees of the supermarket. The employee thankfully survived the attempted murder, but Bittaker again somehow avoided the harsh penalty when he was convicted on a lesser charge of assault with a deadly weapon and sentenced to California's men's colony in San Luis Obispo. This, as Lance mentioned, was where Bittaker would meet Norris.
Yeah, so we're back to this again. This is an extensive rap sheet. You know, and with Bittaker, it's crazy. We talk all the time about escalation of crimes, and here he is again, finally being imprisoned, you would think, for attempted murder. But no, instead, we're gonna give him the lesser charge of assault with a deadly weapon, because we can't prove that he was trying to kill him. It drives me crazy. Like, this is a guy who had just gotten out of prison again for an indefinite sentence. Indefinite. 3 to 15 years. 3 months to 15 years. And he serves 3 years. And we throw him back out on the streets again. So many people were going to pay the price for this man being on the streets. And we're about to get to the horrifying parts of this case. But I don't even know what else we can say, Bailey, but like, it drives me crazy. Like, this is a guy who, more than Norris, had an in and out, an in and out, an in and out, an in and out of prison his whole entire life since he was 16 years old. And here he goes. Now he's going to the California men's colony, and of course we know what's going to happen. But how do we let these people out of prison repeatedly?
I did the math.
Oh, see, I was going to, and then I left it alone.
I was so annoyed at all of the in and outs that I did the rough math, and he should have spent roughly a minimum of 20 years in prison and almost a maximum of 53 years if the 15 wasn't converted to the whole life.
Oh my God.
53 years. If they just held him like they would have, and they clearly should have, he would have not gone on to do anything. Keep in mind, he's only 34 at the time that he was finally arrested and put in the California men's colony. He would have had to serve longer years than he has been alive.
Yeah, it's insane, isn't it? At 34, that means starting at 16 when he first went to prison. That's only 18 years of his life, and he was sentenced to 54 years, did you say?
Roughly 53 would have been the maximum.
That's insane, and yet here he was going in and out. And I don't think he ever served prior to this more than 3 years in prison.
No.
It's wild.
It is.
What do you say?
I say that, I'm not saying this might be a correlation. I'm just saying there's no reports or anything like that. But at the exact same time, he was in the California Youth Authority. He was at the exact same time as Edmund Kemper.
I remember you telling me that. That's crazy, eh?
So it's possible they talked.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. It's absolutely possible that they talked. It's absolutely, we're about to talk about what happens when two become one with Norris and Bittaker, and who knows what happened if those two interacted in prison.
Could the possible whole ending of how some of these victims' lives were taken been a bit of an influence from what he learned?
Definitely. It definitely could. This was, as Bailey put it best when we were researching the case, where two became one in the worst way humanly possible. Both Bittaker and Norris found themselves in San Luis Obispo at the same time, and the two started to become acquainted in 1977, as that was the year that Norris arrived at the prison. Bittaker said that he watched Norris at first from afar and saw that Norris was associating with many of the harder prisoners, including members of the biker gangs that were in prison. The two started to become friends, believe it or not, when Norris started to teach Bittaker how to make jewelry. Norris said that Bittaker was a protector to him, saving him at times from being attacked on at least 2 occasions, and by 1978, the two men had developed a strong bond. Unfortunately, those bonds were over things that you would hope people would never bond over. They discovered that their shared interests included, aside from making jewelry, sexual violence and a deep-rooted hatred against women. Norris told Bittaker that one of his biggest turn-ons was seeing the look of absolute fear and terror in the eyes of a woman. Lawrence admitted that he had not had any known instances of sexual violence, but he told Norris that if he ever did rape a woman, he would kill her to ensure that there was no witness and no evidence. He believed that that was where Norris had made his mistakes in the past and ultimately been the reason why Norris had been caught. While the two were alone, they regularly discussed plans to rape and murder teenage girls after they were released from prison. Over time, their plan evolved into something that was much more elaborate than even simply attacking women at random. The two men created a fantasy where they would attack, rape, and murder one girl each for every teenage year between the ages of 13 and 19. They vowed that once they were both released, they would find one another on the outside.
Bittaker would be the first of the two to be released on October 5th, 1978, where he returned to Los Angeles and actually found gainful employment working as a skilled machinist. Even though Bittaker classified himself as a loner, he started to integrate himself into the community that he lived in, and even shockingly started to earn the reputation as being very generous and a very helpful individual. It almost seemed like reform was a real thing, even for monsters like Bittaker. But, as you'll see, this was not the case. Perhaps it was just a front to mislead everyone and distract them from the true evil. We'll never know. Bittaker was particularly popular, though, with the local teenagers, because he was known to provide beer and marijuana and throw parties for them in his motel. It seemed like Bittaker was always doing some form of grooming. There was even one particular young girl that he befriended and even took care of her for a while, buying her clothes and anything that she needed. She ended up being pregnant. The young girl would later recall that one day while she was out with Bittaker, he pulled a gun on her and told her that the only reason he was allowing her to live was because she was pregnant. 3 months after Bittaker was released, on January 15th, 1979, Norris was released, where he moved in to his mother's home in Redondo Beach. It didn't take long for Norris to return to his former ways. Less than a month after he was released, he had raped a woman and abandoned her in the desert. Norris did find gainful employment during this time, though, working as an electrician. One day, Norris received a letter from Bittaker, and in late February, the two would rekindle their friendship and start making their plans in earnest. The two met at the hotel and decided that they needed to find some sort of vehicle. So they purchased a silver 1977 GMC Vandra. You know the kind, the windowless one with the sliding passenger door that we were all told contains men who wanted to lure us with puppies and candy when we were all kids. This is likely where that urban legend came from. They nicknamed this van Murder Mac, and they outfitted the van with a bed, a cooler, some beers, some cold drinks, clothing, and of course the soon-to-be notorious toolbox. For the next 4 months, the two worked on perfecting their MO, trying to figure out how to get away with their ultimate murderous goals and plans. They picked up at least 20 hitchhikers and didn't assault them in any way or shape or form. They worked on different ideas to attract young women into the van, looking for secluded locations where they could carry out their fantasies, taking photographs of unsuspecting women on the boardwalk, schools, parking lots, you name it. During a night of working on their practice runs, Bittaker drove up to a secluded fire road in the San Gabriel Mountains, an area that he was very familiar with and had spent time with his previous mentioned girlfriend, Mary Ann. The fire road already had a gate with a lock on it, so Bittaker broke it and replaced it with a lock of his own. They assumed that that would ensure that they would be the only ones to have immediate access to this area that they planned to use. After a few more practice runs, Bittaker and Norris decided that it was time to put their plans to the ultimate test.
The one thing that really baffles my mind is that Bittaker and Norris, to a lesser extent, really had a true chance to turn their lives around. Bittaker's job was paying him $1,000 a week, which in today's money is $4,800 a week. I cannot imagine being so addicted to the thrill of something criminal that I would be willing to turn my back on that kind of money. But that is exactly what these two men did. We now need to get into the crimes. This is the hard part of this story, of course. So once again, listener discretion is advised. Lucinda, better known as Cindy Lynn Schaefer, was the first known victim of the Toolbox Killers. Cindy was born on July 9th of 1962 in Bexar County, Texas, and she was only 16 years old when Norris and Bittaker kidnapped her and took her life. Cindy was a beautiful, bright, and hard-working young girl. She had arrived in California only 19 days before her death to stay with her grandparents in their Torrance home, having just completed her junior year in Wisconsin. Cindy had planned to spend the summer working and enjoying the beach. Cindy was a tutor in high school. She taught Spanish, algebra, and geometry, and her ultimate goal in life was to become a language teacher, much like her mother. Cindy also enjoyed playing guitar, and she was a Christian. On the night that Cindy was kidnapped, she was leaving from the church youth group early, after feeling anxious and alone because she didn't really know any of the teenagers from the area. On June 24th, 1979, around 7:45 p.m., Norris saw Cindy walking down a side street as she was walking towards her grandparents' home. He told Bittaker and pointed her out, saying that she was a cute little blonde. The two men pulled up alongside Cindy and offered her a ride and some marijuana, which she declined. Norris and Bittaker then drove further down the road, pulled over, and waited.
I ended up finding some interesting reports that Cindy allegedly stopped to play with a kitten alongside of the road, and that was what allowed Bittaker and Norris to come up with the alternate plan so that they could get her into the van. And when I found those reports, I couldn't help but think that this is exactly how I would get kidnapped as well. There's not very many things that would stop me from playing with a kitten on the side of the road, or any animal, really.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat. Animals are certainly the joy of my life and could easily be the end of it for me too. Regardless, though, of what caused Cindy to take a little bit longer to reach the same van that had previously offered her a ride, Bittaker and Norris did have time to hatch a plan. Norris got out of the van and leaned into the sliding doors with his head and shoulders hidden from sight. When Cindy passed by the van, Norris said a few words to her and then dragged her into the van and closed the door. Bittaker then turned the volume way up on the radio to drown out Cindy's screaming, and Norris bound Cindy's arms and legs, and he gagged her with duct tape as Bittaker drove away towards the San Gabriel Mountains. Bittaker would recall that Cindy had screamed at first when she was grabbed, but that she regained her composure and seemed to accept her circumstances. Hauntingly, Bittaker would say, quote, "I guess she knew what was coming," unquote. When the van reached the fire access road, it was Norris that first would rape Cindy, after he told Bittaker to take a walk and come back in an hour. When Bittaker returned, the two traded places, and Bittaker raped Cindy while Norris went for a walk and kept watch for anyone coming by. When Norris returned, he would rape Cindy for a second time, and Cindy asked Norris if they were going to kill her. Norris told her that they were not going to kill her. Cindy requested that if they were going to kill her, that they would at least give her time to pray. Bittaker looked at her and told her that God was not with her, only devils were with her. Both Bittaker and Norris, of course, said that it was the other man that had wanted to kill Cindy when retelling their versions of what happened. Either way, Cindy's plea for time to pray was not granted, and Norris attempted to strangle her to death. After about 45 seconds, though, Norris became disturbed by the look in her eyes, and he let her go, and he ran to the front of the van and vomited. Bittaker then stepped in and strangled Cindy until she fell to the ground and she was convulsing. Bittaker would then take a wire coat hanger, twist it around her neck with the use of vice grip pliers, and he did so until she stopped convulsing. The two men then wrapped Cindy's body in a plastic shower curtain and threw it over a ledge into a steep canyon, and Bittaker told Norris that wild animals would eat her, so they didn't ever need to be concerned with anyone finding the body.
It really seemed like these two had everything thought out. Their horrifying fantasies were now coming to life, and both men had found the yin to their yang, so to speak. Bittaker had always been violent and held no regard for people at all, while Norris was clearly a sexual predator. But between the two of them, they brought out the absolute worst in one another and brought fear, death, and destruction everywhere they went. Just 2 weeks after the murder of Cindy, on July 8, 1979, Norris and Bittaker would find their second victim. Andrea Joy Hall was born on October 21, 1960, and was only 18 years old when she was murdered. Andrea was found hitchhiking along the Pacific Coast Highway, but before Norris and Bittaker could pull over to pick her up, she was picked up by a different vehicle. Not wanting to give up the chase, the pair followed the vehicle, waiting for it to drop off Andrea, and hoped that it would not be her final destination. They were unfortunately right, and Andrea was dropped off in Redondo Beach. The two men had learned from their practice runs that women were more likely to get into a vehicle for a ride if there was one person in the vehicle, as opposed to two. So Norris hid in the back of the van while Bittaker pulled over and attempted to pick up Andrea. Bittaker offered her a ride, and she accepted and got into the van. Bittaker then told her that there were some cold drinks in the back in the cooler of the van, and if she wanted one, she was more than welcome to get it. As she attempted to get one of the drinks from the cooler, Norris jumped on her from his hiding place. Norris and Andrea had a long fight, and Bittaker even had to slam on the brakes at one point to send Andrea and Norris stumbling when it seemed that Andrea was actually gaining control over the fight. Norris was then able to finally twist Andrea's arm behind her back and was able to subdue her. This caused her to scream out in pain, and then Norris gagged her with duct tape and bound her wrists and her ankles. The two men then drove to their location in the San Gabriel Mountains, just slightly further than they went when they took Cindy. Andrea was raped twice by Bittaker and once by Norris. While Bittaker was raping Andrea the second time, Norris claimed that he thought he saw headlights approaching them in the distance. And when he told Bittaker this, Bittaker put his hands over Andrea's mouth and dragged her into the bushes, while Norris attempted to drive off and find the vehicle he thought he had seen. When Norris returned, believing that there was not a vehicle, the pair then drove to another location that was even deeper into the San Gabriel Mountains. And then Bittaker forced Andrea to walk uphill completely naked, alongside of the road, where he then forced her to perform oral sex on him, and forced her to pose for multiple Polaroid photos. Norris and Bittaker then drove Andrea to a third location, where Bittaker again forced Andrea to walk uphill, and this time Norris left to go get some alcohol. When Norris returned, Bittaker was alone, and he had 2 more Polaroids in his hands that were taken of Andrea. It showed that she was in complete and total fear. Bittaker told Norris that he had told Andrea that he was going to kill her, and he ordered for her to give him as many reasons as she could as to why he should let her live. He then thrust an ice pick through her ear, turning her body over and thrusting the ice pick again into her other ear, stomping on it until the handle broke off. Bittaker then strangled Andrea and threw her body off of the cliff.
While I was researching the case, I came across a pretty brutal description about how brutal an ice pick to the ear is, and as awful as it is, I feel that it helps sum up just how sadistic these 2 men were. Puncturing an eardrum with an ice pick would be one of the most severe types of pain that a person could go through. The victim would suffer instant deafness and pain like you could never even imagine. It's been said that all the victim would hear would be the sound of blood rushing into your brain, and it would cause a very slow and painful death. Norris and Bittaker had seen this type of an attack when they were in prison in a movie that they watched, and they wanted to see how it would work in real life. If you could call it that, Bittaker and Norris would then have a little bit of a cooling off period before their next attack, which came on September 3rd of 1979. On that day, the 2 came across 2 girls named Doris Gilliam and Jacqueline, who was better known as Leah, Lamp. Jackie and Leah had left their homes with the intention of hitchhiking and had sat down at the bus stop while they thumbed for a ride. Bittaker and Norris offered the girls a ride and they accepted, and then once inside of the van they were offered marijuana, which they also accepted. Bittaker would later say in interviews that he had no idea why the girls were hitchhiking because they wanted to go to the beach, which was only 5 minutes away from where they were picked up. He assumed that they were just looking for someone to party with. Leah was only 13 years old, and Jackie was 15 years old. For me, that was haunting because it's literally like these two girls were so innocent. They didn't want to go far. They just wanted to kind of see what life was like. And unfortunately, not long after they started driving, the girls realized that they were not headed towards the beach at all, and they started to panic. Bittaker and Norris tried to calm the girls down, but that didn't work. Leah then tried to open the sliding door to the van to escape, and Norris hit her on the back of the head with a bag that was filled with lead weights, and that knocked Leah unconscious. At that point, Norris overpowered Jackie and he went to gag her. As he was attempting to do that, Leah regained consciousness and again attempted to escape the van. This time she made it outside. Bittaker realized that things were getting out of control at this point, and the escape attempt had actually occurred in front of tennis courts where people were actively playing tennis. Bittaker got out of the van, punched Leah in the face, and put her in the van. He then turned to the people that had witnessed the ordeal and told them that Leah was having a bad LSD trip and that he was taking her home. Bittaker then got back into the van and helped Norris to bind and gag the 2 girls. They then took the girls into the San Gabriel Mountains where they held the girls captive for 2 days. Bailey, if you were playing tennis and you saw a 13-year-old girl jump out of a van and then a 40-something-year-old man punch her in the face and then say, she's just having a bad trip, I'm taking her home. Would you call the police still?
I was just about to say, can we take a moment and talk about how no one said anything when they saw these two grown men physically manhandling children? Like, what happened to that famous TTC slogan line, if you see something, say something? Like, how come no one felt compelled at all to call anyone? There were no reports.
It's crazy. And, like, I don't know. I always say, I hope that one day, when the people find out what horrifying thing happened there, I truly hope that they live with it on their conscience. I hope they put two and two together and realize that they had an opportunity to not just save two girls' lives potentially, but also to save more lives and to do something by calling the police here. Like, it just, stories like this, moments like this frustrate me to no end.
It baffles my mind.
So, as I said, it continues. So both men slept in the van alongside Jacqueline and Leah, and they took turns acting as the lookout to make sure that their little camping trip, as Bittaker called it, was not disturbed. During those 2 days, Bittaker would walk Leah to a nearby hill and force her to take pornographic Polaroids before returning her to the van every time. Bittaker also asked Norris to take photos of he and Jacqueline together, both nude and clothed, and he also had Norris take photos of him raping Jacqueline. Bittaker also told Jacqueline to pretend that she was his cousin. Jacqueline was completely used, abused, and tortured, and Leah was forced to watch on. Jacqueline's breasts were stabbed with an ice pick, her nipples were pulled at and torn by vice grips, and she was just completely disregarded by both Lawrence and Bittaker. The photos that were taken of Jacqueline were incredibly haunting. These are photos of a girl who clearly has a black eye and is clearly bound, but she's being forced to smile. She's being forced to look happy in these photos while she was in a literal living hell with two monsters and her friend. After almost 2 days of captivity, the girls were murdered. During the trials, Norris claimed that he suggested that Jacqueline be killed quickly, and that maybe they could release Leah because they had been mostly cooperative. Bittaker, he said, though, replied by saying, quote, "No, they only die once anyways," unquote. Jacqueline would be stabbed in the ear with an ice pick and then strangled to death, and afterwards Bittaker forced Leah out of the van and yelled at her, telling her that she wanted to stay a virgin so she could die a virgin, and then Norris hit her in the head with a sledgehammer. Bittaker then strangled Leah until he believed that she had died, but she opened her eyes. This caused Norris to freak out, and he began bludgeoning her to death while Bittaker strangled her. Both of the bodies of Jacqueline and Leah were thrown over the embankment and into chaparral. It hits me hard. This one's haunting. This is two girls that, like I said earlier, were likely naively deciding to go hitchhiking so that they could see what partying was like. They were 5 minutes from their house and they were 5 minutes from the beach, and they got snatched up by these two monsters who had nothing but death and destruction on their minds. This is probably two young girls who had heard about marijuana. They wanted to see what life was like on the other side of life, and they were forced instead into being captives, and one watched on as the other was tortured, raped, and murdered before she was also murdered. This is two girls, like I said, I think they were innocent and naive. Obviously they were innocent. I think they were naive. They were looking for something, and when they were offered a ride in some marijuana, they got way more than they ever could have imagined, and I don't know what else to say.
I mean, I completely agree, and it's heartbreaking to know that, like we just discussed, that there was an opportunity for these two, especially, to be saved because there were witnesses, but no one took it upon themselves to do anything. And I'm not saying that Leah should have died, but could you imagine the kind of life she would have had to lead if they let her go and she was stuck having that trauma of listening to those screams and hearing that and then having that inevitable survivor's guilt as well?
Yeah, it's crazy. It's just, I don't know. We're both parents. This is the kind of thing that screws with your head because, you know,
it's a situation both of us don't want our children in, but it's also a situation that we don't want anyone in general to be in.
Absolutely. And this is your biggest fear, right? It's like, you know, full disclosure, my kid wants bigger boundaries. And it's like, how far do we let you go so that we feel safe and we think we're mitigating something? But, you know, this is 5 minutes from home. That's not far, you know?
Completely agree. It's not something that anyone should ever have to go through.
Nope, absolutely not.
And unfortunately, nearly 2 months later on Halloween night of 1979 came the most unforgettable victim of Bittaker and Norris. This is also where the two decided to change their entire MO, surprisingly. Shirley Lynette Ledford was born on March 4th, 1963, in Los Angeles, California, and she was a 16-year-old waitress who accepted a ride from someone that she recognized as a regular at the restaurant that she worked at part-time. Shirley was hitchhiking home from a Halloween party when she was offered a ride home by Norris and Bittaker. Once Shirley was inside the van, she was offered marijuana by Norris, and she said that she didn't want any. Bittaker then drove the van to a side street, and Norris pulled out a knife and bound and gagged Shirley using construction tape, but not before a fight broke out. Shirley fought for her life, even at one point grabbing the knife from Norris and cutting her hands up pretty bad. Once Shirley was subdued, Bittaker took Norris's place in the back seat with Shirley while Norris drove around. Bittaker completely tortured and tormented Shirley during this entire time. Bittaker removed the tape from her mouth and started to smack her around and mock her. He then beat her with his fist and screamed at her, saying that he only wanted her to say something. When Shirley started instead to scream, he yelled at her and told her to scream louder. When she stopped screaming, Bittaker started to beat on her again, trying to make her scream some more. Bittaker was so excited that he finally had an opportunity to use this tape recorder that he had, so he decided to record the entire ordeal. Shirley then started to cry and begged for her life as Bittaker was touching her. She begged him to stop, and he told her to scream all she wanted. And he started to attack her with his fists and a hammer, and then raped her and sodomized her. On the recording that Bittaker was making, you could hear the sounds of Bittaker's toolbox moving around and him grabbing the tools and replacing them. You can clearly hear Shirley screaming and yelling no at Bittaker as she tried to fight back. Norris would say that he remembered hearing nothing but screams, constant screams during this entire time. Norris and Bittaker would then switch places, and Norris implored Shirley to scream again as he hit record on the tape recorder. Shirley told Norris that she would scream for him if he stopped hitting her, and then started to scream, and Norris told her to keep screaming until he told her to stop. Norris then reached for the sledgehammer and struck Shirley on the left elbow, causing it to break. Shirley told Norris that he had broken her elbow and she begged for him to stop, but Norris proceeded to hit her 25 times on the same elbow with that very same sledgehammer, and then asked her, and quote, "What are you sniveling about?" unquote. And Shirley continued to scream and cry in pain, understandably. Finally, after 2 hours, which I'm sure felt like an eternity, Norris killed Shirley by strangling her with a wire coat hanger, tightened with pliers, and Shirley died with her eyes wide open. Bittaker then made the decision to leave Shirley's body on some random lawn just to get the reaction from the press to see what would happen. They drove around randomly and selected a house in Sunland, and Norris dumped Shirley's body in a bed of ivy in the front lawn. Shirley's body would be found the following morning by a jogger, and the autopsy would reveal that Shirley had died from strangulation, but had also endured blunt force trauma to her face, head, breasts, and left elbow. Her genitalia and her rectum were also torn, and in addition to all of that, she had a puncture on her left hand, and a finger on her right hand had been slashed. When she was found, the coat hanger that was twisted around her neck and used to strangle her was twisted so tightly that it was the size of a silver dollar. The 17-minute-long torture tape that was later recovered was explained by Bittaker as only proof that the three had a threesome, and that Shirley began screaming that he and Norris were to kill her. You could really see the progression and the rage with each brutality of each attack that has taken place. What started out as rape and strangle quickly progressed to sodomization and torture.
Yeah, and what I'll get into a little bit later when the searches went on is they were actually going to continue to progress with their torture as they had acidic liquids that they were planning to use on their next victim. Like, these two men had more plans and more disgusting plans than we even saw to this point in their rampage.
I didn't even think it could get worse until I did read that they had acidic stuff. And the 17-minute-long torture video was more, or recording, not video, was more than enough to put nightmares in my mind. Now to imagine, like, adding acid to that torture, it's unimaginable.
Yeah, I mean, as mentioned, like, they got their ice pick idea from movies, and it's kind of, I'm not one of those people that believes that, like, video games and movies are to blame for everything that's wrong in the world, but these are two men that certainly seemed okay with getting new, disgusting ideas from anywhere that they could possibly get them from. Thankfully, if you can use that word in this case, this entire run of terror would come to an end. Sometimes it seems that a bad guy does good things. Serial rapist Joseph Jackson, an inmate who Norris was friends with at the California men's colony, would become reacquainted with Norris during the time of the murders. Norris would go on to tell Jackson about everything that he and Bittaker had been up to over the previous 5 months, describing their attacks in great detail, bragging about the crimes. Jackson said at the time he didn't believe Norris at first until Shirley's body was discovered exactly as Norris had explained it. That was all it took for Jackson to go to his lawyer to relay everything that Norris and Bittaker had been allegedly doing. The lawyer and Jackson then went to the police, where Hermosa Beach detective Paul Bynum would take the lead on Shirley's investigation, and then the lead on the investigation into Norris and Bittaker. Armed with the information that Jackson came forward with, Paul was able to connect Bittaker and Norris into an attack that took place on September 30th, and he also noticed that their stories lined up with numerous missing persons cases that were open for girls in the area. In the incident that took place on September 30th, a woman named Robin Robeck had been kidnapped and raped, but police had not been able to identify the two Caucasian men that had been involved. Robin had reported that she had been taken by two men who had sprayed her in the face with mace, and then they had dragged her to their silver van. Paul sent an investigator to Robin's home in Oregon, where she lived, and she was shown a series of mugshots to see if she would be able to identify Bittaker and Norris as her attackers. Without any pause, Robin was able to point out the photos of the two men, and this was enough for the police to take all of Jackson's tips seriously, and so they placed Norris and Bittaker under surveillance. It did not take long for investigators to find Norris doing something that was an arrestable offense. Are you surprised out there? Within days, he was observed selling marijuana, and on November 20th of 1979, Norris was arrested by the Hermosa Beach Police for violation of his parole. Once Norris was arrested, that gave investigators permission to search Norris's home, and they found approximately 500 photographs of young women that were taken in parking lots, gyms, walking down roads, at schools, and at the beach. Investigators realized that every single one of those photographs represented a potential victim. They also found the photograph of a naked and posed Jacqueline Gilliam. In a stroke of luck, while police were at Norris's home, Bittaker called. One of the officers picked up the phone and said that Norris was on the roof fixing the antenna, and that sent Bittaker into a panic. Bittaker hurriedly cleaned out his van of all photographs and, he believed, all evidence. He took a bag of evidence from the van and buried it in an undisclosed location. Police then went to the Burbank Motel, which they had found a card for, and they believed that Bittaker was staying there, and he was arrested for the rape of Robin Robeck. The strange thing, though, was that even though Robin had picked out the photograph of Norris and Bittaker, she was not able to pick them out from a police lineup. Both men, though, were held on parole violations, Norris for selling marijuana, and Bittaker for drugs that were found inside of his motel room. Investigators continued in earnest, and police searched Bittaker's motel room and the van. In the motel room, they found several photographs showing Andrea and Jacqueline, and they also found a sledgehammer, a plastic bag filled with lead weights, a book that explained how to locate police radio frequencies, a jar of Vaseline, 2 necklaces, and inside of the van, they found something that Bittaker had forgotten as he swept for evidence. Inside of the cassette player was the recordings of Shirley screaming and begging for mercy while being tortured and raped. Investigators also found 7 bottles of acidic materials, which they would later find out, as we mentioned, were going to be used on Norris and Bittaker's next victim as a form of torture. It's crazy. You see this so many times. So many times criminals think that they've covered all of their bases, and they haven't. Norris was the type of man who just couldn't keep his mouth shut. He bragged about everything. He thought in his serial rapist friend Jackson, he thought that he had a friend that would think he was, do I say cool, for all of the awesome crimes that he was doing. I mean, thank God he was a braggart, because it was his mouth that ultimately stopped more victims from meeting the cruel fate that these 2 men were dishing out. And then you also have Bittaker. This guy, first of all, he sweeps the van. He gets rid of almost everything except his treasured tape that he leaves in the cassette deck. But then he also seemed to believe they were never going to search his motel room because it was filled with evidence. This is a smart guy. This is a guy we talked about. He had a high IQ. And yet, they got sloppy. How many times do we see this, Bailey? Like, thank God criminals are stupid. But how stupid were these guys?
Well, you could really tell, especially like throughout their own history amongst themselves, that they both almost felt a form of invincibility. Because it seemed like no matter what, they just continued doing what they were doing. And as we've heard, and as we've now seen, they didn't even feel like they would get caught. And even if they were to get caught, they probably believed that, you know, even with all these years of going in and out of prison, the only evidence that they have is they would just get a slap on the wrist and released back out into the public. So they felt completely invincible, almost like a god complex. Not only were they able to control how these people were able to now die, but they also felt invincible because they went from being able to properly get away with their murders in the mountains to being bold and brave enough to just leave a body on a front lawn, expecting no evidence whatsoever to even be caught from the body alone.
Yeah, it's wild. I mean, it's like you said, we see we've said it a couple times, we see the evolution of the crime, and it's like when these two met in prison, they were there because, as Bittaker put it, Norris was there because he raped someone and let them live, and theoretically, Bittaker also knew that he was there because he didn't finish the job when he killed that person at the supermarket. Or mind you, he might have been in prison for a lot longer, but Bittaker said to Norris, your mistake is that you let them live. So they did. They believed that if they eradicated the life after torturing someone, they were fine. No one was ever going to turn them in. And I guess if you really want to think about it in a not completely stupid way, Norris probably just figured, well, this guy's a career criminal too, so at least he's someone I can tell everything that's been going on. It's wild.
They probably bonded in prison, and that's probably where he came up with this, like, prisoner oath. I won't stab you in the back, you won't stab me in the back. I know information that you told me in prison, now you know information of me outside of prison.
Yeah, it's frightening. But thank God they were stupid.
Shirley Ledford was one of the women that Jackson had mentioned being a victim, and her mother was actually brought in and asked to do one of the most unimaginable things a person, let alone a parent, could ever experience. This poor woman was asked to listen to the tape that was made of the hauntingly painful last moments of Shirley's life, to confirm if it really was her daughter or not. She sadly confirmed that it was her daughter on the tape, and the police confirmed that the two men were Bittaker and Norris. 10 days after the pair were apprehended, Norris would attend a preliminary hearing in regard to September 30th's rape of Robin, and it was obvious that Norris stressed out and that he was cracking under the pressure and the realization that he was going to go down for all of his crimes. Norris made the decision to waive his Miranda rights. And at the hearing, when he was questioned by Detective Bynum and Deputy District Attorney Stephen Kay, the questioning first pertained to Robin, but then they started to question him about the statements that Jackson had given to them and the evidence that was found at his home in Bittaker's motel room. At first, Norris denied everything and said that he had nothing to do with it and had nothing to do with any of the rapes or murders or disappearances. But when all the evidence was being presented to him, suddenly he changed his tune and started to confess to being an accomplice, stating that Bittaker was more responsible than he was. Norris then started to talk, just like he had done with Jackson, and he told the investigators everything. Investigators knew then that they had the two people in custody that were actually responsible for these serial crimes. Norris relayed details that only guilty parties would have known. In February of 1980, both Norris and Bittaker were formally charged with the murders of 5 girls. Bittaker was denied bail at the arraignment, and Norris's bail was set at $10,000. Within 1 month of the charges being laid, Norris accepted a plea deal and stated that he would testify against Bittaker in return for the prosecution not seeking the death penalty against him, nor life without the possibility of parole. Norris also agreed to go with investigators to the San Gabriel Mountains in an attempt to recover the bodies of the 2 other missing girls. Despite extensive efforts, the bodies of Cindy and Andrea were never found, but on February 9th, 1980, the skeletal remains of Leah and Jacqueline were found at the bottom of the canyon along a dry riverbed. The remains of the 2 girls were scattered in an area over hundreds of feet in diameter, and the ice pick was still lodged in Jacqueline's skull. Leah's skull also had multiple skull indentations, evidence of the multiple hammer blows that Norris had confessed to inflicting. On March 18, 1980, Norris pled guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of second-degree murder in relation to Andrea, 2 counts of rape and 1 count of robbery. His sentencing was postponed to May 7, 1980. In return for his plea deal, Norris received 45 years to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 30 years, which was in 2010. Bittaker was arraigned on April 24, 1980, on 29 charges for kidnapping, rape, sodomy, murder, as well as various charges of criminal conspiracy and possession of a firearm. He was also charged with 2 counts of conspiracy to commit murder that dated back to December 1979, when he had attempted to persuade 2 inmates to murder Robin Robeck to prevent her from testifying against him. The rape charges pertaining to Robin were ultimately dropped because, as mentioned, Robin was unable to pick Bittaker and Norris out of a police lineup, and there was lack of physical evidence. When Bittaker was asked to enter his plea, he refused to speak, and the judge then entered a plea of not guilty on Bittaker's behalf. The trial would begin on January 19, 1981, and of course, the star witness against Bittaker was Norris, who began testifying on January 22nd. Bittaker's defense team confirmed that Norris had in fact been the dominant member of the duo, and that Bittaker had only become aware of Norris's activities right before the two were arrested, when Norris had confessed to him that he had murdered several of the girls that they had encountered and sexually assaulted. The most damning piece of evidence at the trial, though, was a 17-minute audio recording that was done as Shirley was tortured, abused, and murdered. Norris testified that Bittaker loved the tape, and he would listen to it every time he drove the van. The tape was played in court on January 29th, and the district attorney warned everyone in the courtroom by saying, quote, "For those of you who do not know what hell is like, you will find out," unquote.
That tape might just be one of the most horrifying pieces of evidence ever heard at any trial. As the tape was played in the courtroom that was filled with over 100 people, many people left the room and many people cried. And Bittaker? He sat there, undisturbed as the tape was playing in its entirety, and he smiled for the duration of the recording. Bittaker was leaning forward and reading the transcript of the tape as it played. On February 5th, Bittaker took the stand on his own behalf, and he denied having any knowledge of the abduction and murder of Cindy. He then claimed that he had paid Andrea to pose for the Polaroids, and he had also paid her for sex. He said that it was Norris then who had walked Andrea into the mountains before returning alone and telling him that Andrea had to find her own way home. Bittaker also told a similar story in regards to Jacqueline and Leah. He said that Jacqueline had accepted money for sex and money to pose for the photos that he had, and that he had last seen the two girls with Norris inside of the van. I just want to add here, this explanation is ridiculous. They're up in the mountains in the middle of nowhere, and he just last saw them in the van with Norris. Where the hell did he go? Did he walk home from there?
But also, again, if you see something, say something. Aren't you a little concerned as to where these two individuals went when you left them with your friend?
That's fair, too. That's a very fair point. The trial would ultimately last for over 3 weeks, and on February 9th, 1981, the prosecution and defense completed their closing arguments. The prosecution, led by Stephen Kay, apologized to the jury that he was only seeking the death penalty, and he said that he wished that the law would allow for him to request the same suffering that Bittaker had inflicted on those young girls. Stephen held up photos of the 5 young girls to the jury as he closed his case. He said that the case was one of the most shocking and brutal cases in the history of American crime, and he said, quote, "Make no mistake, ladies and gentlemen, a punishment of life imprisonment in prison would be a total, complete victory for him. If the death penalty is not appropriate in this case, when will it ever be?" Unquote. Defense attorney Albert Garber requested that the jury discount the testimony of Norris, saying that what Bittaker had said was true, that Norris had been the one that had committed the actual murders. He said that the prosecution had a bloodlust, and that was why they continuously brought up the gory details of the case. He pointed out that all of Bittaker's prior murders before the supermarket incident were non-violent crimes.
As an interesting side note, Bittaker's trial would be the first that was ever broadcasted and publicized, much to the objection of Bittaker and the defense team themselves. The footage included the people fleeing the courtroom when that horrifying tape was being played. On February 17th, 1981, after 3 days of deliberation, the jury would return and find Bittaker guilty on 5 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder, 5 counts of kidnapping, 9 counts of rape, 2 counts of forcible or oral copulation, 1 count of sodomy, and 3 counts of unlawful possession of a firearm. Deliberations then began 2 days later on February 19th to decide whether Bittaker would receive life without parole or a death sentence. Those deliberations only lasted 90 minutes, and the jury returned to the courtroom with their belief that Bittaker should be sentenced to death for the 5 counts of first-degree murder. Bittaker showed no emotion whatsoever as the verdict was being delivered, but instead stared down at the jurors. On March 24th, in line with what the jury had decided, Bittaker was officially sentenced to death. In the event that the death sentence was ever reverted to a life sentence, Judge Thomas Fredericks ordered that the alternative sentence be 199 years, 4 months imprisonment, that would take immediate effect, ensuring that Bittaker would never ever get out of prison again.
Bittaker, of course, appealed the conviction and the sentencing, saying that there were procedural errors, including the validity of warrants that were used to search his van and motel room. His appeal, though, was dismissed on June 22nd of 1989, and the courts ruled that any procedural errors were minor and did not affect the overall verdict in the case. Bittaker's initial execution date was set for December 29th of 1989, and Bittaker appealed that decision. And on June 11th of 1990, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the decision that he should be executed. A new execution date was set for July 23rd of 1991, and Bittaker again appealed the decision of the U.S. Supreme Court and was granted a further stay of execution on July 9th of 1991. In 2019, after all of the years of showing no remorse, Bittaker reportedly started to feel remorse as his health took a turn for the worse and he started to feel emotions for the first time in his life, or so he said. On December 13th of 2019, Bittaker died on death row. Ironically, he passed away on Friday the 13th at the age of 79, leaving many people without the closure that they deserved. Norris originally came up for parole near the end of 2009, but he declined the hearing, and that automatically pushed the next hearing forward 10 years. He was denied parole in 2019, and he died in prison at the age of 72 on February 24th of 2020, just 2 months after Bittaker died. Very near to his death, Bittaker was being interviewed after he got close with Laura Brand, and he told her that Norris had the locations wrong for Andrea and Cindy, and he drew her a map to show where the bodies might be found. He said that Cindy's location was about a mile away from where Norris had said, and that Norris was far off on the place that they had dumped the body of Andrea. The areas that Bittaker pointed out, though, were never searched, as it was believed that those areas had been checked previously.
It baffles me that police officers can just be like, it was probably searched, and just walk away. It's like, you literally have someone telling you this is where it is. Go back and double search. That's why people have their eyes on things.
The reason that they won't is, twofold. First of all, they don't want to spend the money because taxpayer dollars, which they blow on all kinds of stupid shit. But, for something like that, it would cost too much money and too much manpower to do it. And then the other thing is, either they or the families could have just decided to just leave it alone because it's been so long that the families might not want the open wound of all their names being put back in the media again. So it's probably one or both or a combination. So, yeah.
It blows my mind that, at that moment in time, the police were just like, no, it was probably searched. Oh, well.
Oh, I know. When that was on the documentary, and I was just like, how? How do you not at least, try?
Yeah, there's a reason there's volunteer police officers.
Yeah.
Send them.
There's plenty of volunteers that would be willing to go, hike through the area and look. You know what I mean?
I'll fly down.
Yeah, like, I'll go.
This case and the reverberations from it were felt far and wide. People who didn't live in California knew of the Toolbox Killers and knew of the circumstances surrounding the case. And parents from all over the world really started to rein in their children as much as they could and warn them more than ever about stranger danger and taking rides from people that they didn't know. However, one of the ways that this case was felt very more close to home was when, unfortunately, Detective Paul Bynum, who was the chief investigator on the case and played a major, massive part in getting Norris and Bittaker behind bars, would commit suicide in December of 1987. Paul was only 39 years old at the time, and he wrote a 10-page suicide note which he referred to the murders that they committed and said that their crimes haunted him, and he always dwelled upon their crimes and lived in fear for the day that they would inevitably be released from prison. One can only imagine the things that he had to take part in and see throughout this case up to the very end. Paul Bynum and his hard work and his tireless push to keep these men behind bars will forever never be forgotten. It has been widely reported that the audio recording from the van that immortalized the torture of Shirley is still in the possession of the FBI and in fact used to desensitize new recruits to this day. We aren't 100% sure if this is true, but we could certainly believe it, as it is highly regarded as one of the most damning and horrific pieces of evidence ever in any case.
Bailey, how was your first run-through on research and writing and recording an episode?
As someone who enjoys these kind of podcasts and cases, this was definitely a fun experience on this side of the microphone. Full disclosure, I did find the transcript of the tape, and reading that was probably one of the hardest parts of researching this case, because curiosity definitely killed this cat. There was just some things that are best left out of the public, and I'm beyond glad that the actual tape has never seen the light of day. Cases like these leave a lot of questions, I find, though, and I've had a lot of fun doing this.
Well, it's good. I've enjoyed having you. It's kind of nice to have someone to talk to instead of just staring at my screen and talking into this microphone by myself all the time. So, I wanted to ask you, do you think that Bittaker's profession that he felt remorse at the end of his life was real?
I think, honestly, yes. Because towards the end of your life, you are sitting there and you are definitely reliving your entire life and you are rethinking things. And especially going through such a medical trauma such as cancer, which he claimed to have had, and feeling your body shut down, that must have been absolutely terrifying. But also it would have given him a little clarity on some of the feelings and fear that he put into his victims as well. So maybe that did kind of give him extra clarity and give him the actual feelings to feel the remorse.
I never know how much I should share about myself and my own life, but at first blush, I'm one of those people that's kind of like, no, I don't think that you can just like suddenly find emotions that you never had before. But I lived a lot of my life after taking psychology courses in university thinking that I was a sociopath. I didn't have emotions, so to speak. I didn't feel remorse. I didn't have empathy for sure. And as I grew up and got married and had a family and matured a little bit, I guess I've come to realize that I have those things. So whether they were developed or dormant or what my problem was, I do believe that it's possible. Now, with Bittaker, I can never be sure. You know, I watched the documentary and I wondered if he was just grooming his interviewer. He basically took her on as a daughter. He wanted to be an uncle to her unborn child, and when she had the child, there was a part of me that thought that he might just be saying what he thought she wanted to hear. He was saying what he could say to keep his name out in the public near the end of his life, because he realized that soon he was going to run out of time to share his words.
I agree, but I also feel that it's been mentioned multiple times in this case that he was a highly manipulative person who was able to actually sit there, and he was smart, so he knew how to manipulate things and manipulate all these different situations. But also, you could tell that he had that loving, nurturing undertone to him because of the specific facts that he's mentioned in the past, that he felt no one loved him. He did take on a responsibility of already a pregnant neighbor and wanted to be there and provide help and do things up until the point that she was no longer considered needed. But he never hurt her because he knew what growing up without a parent was like. So when he latched on to the criminal whisperer or the serial killer whisperer, Laura, he may have reopened up those feelings of vulnerability that he did have, knowing that he didn't have a mother and this woman was pregnant and like she needed to be protected almost in a sort of way for the kid specifically. Maybe he saw himself in that kid and knew that if he did something to the mother, then that kid could turn out just like him.
That's fair. I like that. I never thought of it completely from that angle. It's very true. Like you're right. To be as manipulative as he in particular was, you have to have some understanding of people's emotions and how people are going to react to certain things. And I like that. He did say a lot that he wondered if he had been loved, if he would have turned out differently. So it's true. And you could even go as far as saying that's why he was wanting to be involved with Laura. I didn't really get the full understanding whether the father of her child was in her life either, but it could have been another case of him loving on that child just so that someone else was loving on that child. So I like that.
Bred the feeling that he never got to experience.
Yeah, that's fair. Well, Bailey, thank you again so much for being a part of this long episode. It was a lot of work. I really appreciated having you on the show. Do you have anything else that you want to say?
I just want to say thank you again so much, Lance, for letting me come on here and sharing your audience with me. It's been an absolute pleasure getting into the trenches of the grim and gruesome here with you. Don't forget, follow Lance and the Gone But Never Forgotten podcast on all social media platforms. Also, don't forget, pick up their shirts. I can 100% vouch that they are comfortable and they wear amazing. So pick it up, and I wear mine quite often very proudly.
Thanks so much, Bailey. You're the best. And thank you to all of you goners out there. As Bailey said, hop over on social media and let us know what you thought of this episode. What do you think of its length? It's a little longer than we're used to. What did you think of having Bailey as a co-host? Should we have her back? I vote yes. Do you believe that Bittaker truly felt remorse at the end of his life? I'd love to hear what you guys think. If you like what we're doing here on GBNF, please also hop over to Patreon and support the show. You can get access to special episodes and perks and truly help the show to grow in leaps and bounds. Check out patreon.com/GBNF podcast for more. One more time, thank you all for listening to this special edition of Gone But Never Forgotten. For Bailey, I'm Lance, and I'll see you back here next week. Don't forget to be well, be safe, and as always, be better.